Okay, I think we can get started. Annoyingly, I can't see the chat when I'm screen sharing, which is a little annoying. Let me just stop sharing for a second and see if I can pull up the chat and just have it to the side. Okay, I think I can pull it aside so that I can still see it. Great. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Perfect. So, welcome to week one of the ClinGen-PAPERI workshop. Wafa, is there anything that you wanted to say before I get started with just the live Q&A?
No, you can start.
Okay, perfect. It's great to see all of you. I know that some really great questions and feedback have come through, and so we'll just see how this first week goes, and we can definitely adjust. This is a flexible setting. I am happy to actively discuss things with you, but I did prep about 18 slides or so with questions that came through ahead of time. So let's get started with that. And to remind everyone, week one was a ClinGen and resources overview. And so I sent a couple videos through and then also a couple articles and gave that Google form that Wafa very nicely created so that we had that. So for the agenda, we'll just start with administrative feedback and then prepped questions from the forum grouped by theme. I try to, when I do these types of Q&As, group them by theme because many questions are similar. And so I don't have to add those questions over and over again. We can at least group them by theme. And then if time, I think we will have time, live questions. And this Q&A, with my permission, is being recorded so that those can be available for participants who are unable to make it because of time zone issues. One request from me, if possible, I request that you please submit questions to the forum by Thursday, your time each week. Because there is a time zone difference, the live Q&A happens relatively soon in the morning for me, and I'm often booked until this meeting and have to prep the previous day. I was lucky today that I was able to pull up the form and did see about five or so additional questions come through and included many of them. Um, but I cannot always guarantee that I'm able to pull up that form in time. And otherwise, you'll just be sending questions in the middle of the night for me, and I might not be able to get to them and answer them ahead of time on this slide deck. So if possible, just because I do try to send things on Sundays to give as much time as possible, please do try to fill the form out by Thursday if you can. And I will also say I try to pull at least one question from each person. So if you've submitted numerous questions, you may not see all of them in the deck today because there are people who submitted 10 to 15 questions each. And I wanted to try to include as many folks as possible here. Okay. So for administrative feedback, we fielded questions about technical issues, but please feel free to comment in the chat if you have any other questions or concerns about accessing anything that I sent via email. You can also provide feedback as to the length of the videos and articles. I had one question in the forum if I can share the PowerPoints, and I'm happy to share PDFs of the slides relevant to the 4 weeks at the end of the course to really just give you some takeaway materials at the end. But I would like to prioritize folks watching those videos and reading those articles ahead of time, and then at the very end you would get those summary slide decks, just because I think it is very valuable to watch those videos ahead of these Q&As and not just review the PowerPoints. So yes, I will provide those at the very end in PDF format. They may not be the exact slides because if you've noticed, there's going to be a range of different folks giving these presentations, but I'll at least provide slides that I have that are relevant to all 4 weeks. So I'll leave space for a moment. Does anyone have any other administrative questions or feedback that you have at this point after week one? Feel free to stick that in the chat, raise your hand, unmute. Happy to take that now. Okay. If anything comes up, feel free to still, I have the chat pulled on my other monitor, so feel free to enter that into the chat, or you have my email and can respond to that. But most people have been good as to responding with their questions as far as technical issues. Okay, so the first theme that I have as far as sets of questions is contributing to ClinGen and just questions related generally to ClinGen. So one question that multiple people asked is how can researchers and clinicians, or how can I um, contribute meaningfully to ClinGen or ClinGen expert curation efforts? So I cannot emphasize enough, and hopefully you understood this in the videos, that ClinGen is driven by volunteers. I would say that we maybe have 20, 30, 40 staff, and we have 3,000 volunteers. So we could not run without volunteers from everywhere. And we really encourage anyone with the bandwidth and willingness to volunteer for ClinGen. So there are multiple ways to volunteer with ClinGen. So the first one, which was the original way, was volunteer to curate. So if anyone wants to learn how to, and we'll go through this session of these 4 weeks, and you'll learn a little bit about variant curation and gene curation and the other types of curation. So you can volunteer to curate in one of our expert panels. There's either comprehensive curation, and so this would be gene curation, variant curation. I don't think actionability is taking volunteers right now, but this is very clearly listed which expert panels are taking volunteers on our website. If you do not have the amount of time to give to curate as a comprehensive volunteer, so curating genes or variants, we do say this takes approximately 8 hours of time, of a volunteer's time per month, to prep for curations. If you don't
Che poi
have
ogni
that
tanto
amount of time to provide, we also have another opportunity that's a bit asynchronous. Also, if the time zone differences don't work for you, it's a bit asynchronous. It's called baseline curation, and this is really still being involved in ClinGen annotating papers for expert panels to use in their curation efforts. And so in this case, you'd be given a list of papers and a way to annotate them using our annotation software called Hypothesis. And you would read those papers and add little tags and comments when you find probands or variants or segregation evidence. And so that's another way to contribute offline in an asynchronous way uh, with whatever amount of time that you have to be able to provide. So those are two different ways that you can volunteer to curate. And then also, we think this is extremely valuable, is you can volunteer as an expert. So if you're a laboratory director, if you're a clinician, if you're a genetic counselor, if you're a researcher, we would love to have you participate in our expert panels. And there's a separate form for this where you tell us a little bit about your expertise, and you look at the expert panels that are available to accept expert volunteers. And so both options can be accessed from the ClinGen homepage at clinicalgenome.org. I'm going to escape out of this real quick and show you that. So if you just go to clinicalgenome.org, the very front, there's volunteer as an expert, and you can click that, or volunteer to curate. And both of them involve taking surveys. And so I really do suggest, if you're interested in being involved in ClinGen, no amount of time is too little and no amount of experience is too little. And we very happily would welcome you to participate in ClinGen. Okay, so that is the first question about contributing to ClinGen. The next question that was provided in the form is, how is long-term funding and sustainability being ensured? So I'm sure you saw in the talk that ClinGen currently is funded by the National Institute of Health in the United States. It's funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute. We actually have existed for the last 13 years, and grants usually run in 4 to 5 year cycles. And we are coming up on our last grant year right now, and we just submitted grants again in the fall, early summer, or late summer. To try to maintain that funding, but we have also taken multiple steps to try to sustain long-term funding. So a couple years ago, we have been designated as a global core biodata resource. And these are resources that have been determined to be integral for genetics and genomics across the world. And the goal of being listed on this list is the hope that this designation could work to secure global funding should funding become an issue. And so there are many other resources throughout the world that are listed as global core biodata resources, and they just started having meetings, steering committee meetings this year to try to discuss potential future funding to secure ClinGen and these other resources. Additionally, we have partnerships. These can be with pharmaceutical companies, patient advocacy groups, et cetera, that provide additional funding for certain expert panels. And I will say we are extremely transparent when we have that, and we make sure to manage all conflicts of interest by declaring everything on our website. And having people fill out conflict of interest forms so that if an expert panel has pharmaceutical funding, they are not conflicted and the agenda of the expert panel is not overly driven by the partnership and the funding. So that's another source of funding that we have to try to diversify. And then we also have started to explore becoming a nonprofit to allow for donations. And that work began at the end of last year, just trying to secure our future here. Another question about ClinGen is about the member directory and the lack of institutions, geographic regions, and filtering by region or country to make the directory more useful. We recognize that. That used to be available. Unfortunately, this was a recent and necessary change. As you all know, ClinGen is located in the United States, and given the priorities of the current administration, we found it best to remove this information from our website, unfortunately. If individuals would still like to collaborate with those who are based in a particular region or country, we are more than happy to support this, and you can contact us at ClinGen@clinicalgenome.org, and we can try to facilitate that. It's just not publicly available at this time. This may be different in the future, but this is where we are now. A few people asked about examples of how ClinGen and ClinVar impacted patients. We are always, and our funders are always very interested in this. As you can imagine, it's a bit difficult to quantify. We're always looking at publications and who is citing our frameworks and publishing and adding to our frameworks. But as far as stories for patient care, we've tried to collect feedback over the years. When ClinGen celebrated our 10th anniversary, we included a survey on our website to get some feedback about ClinGen and how ClinGen impacts the lives of genetics professionals. And so I have some text blurbs on that. I will say anecdotally that I have encountered many individuals who have been touched and changed by ClinGen. I feel really lucky to say that I've been contacted by patients all over the world because of the trust that they have in ClinGen and asked to help with variant or gene curations or help to connect them with collaborators that can help with their patient care. So I can give you one particular anecdote for that. One of the expert panels that I've worked with pretty much from the very beginning when I was a trainee with ClinGen in 2016, it was only 3 years old, is the hearing loss expert panel. That's one of our first expert panels that we've had, and we have hundreds of expert panels now. And so I am listed as one of the coordinators for the hearing loss expert panel in ClinVar. And so a couple from China reached out to me after finding my contact information on the ClinVar website. They actually reached out to me in Chinese, and Google and Gmail is fabulous in that we were able to have an email conversation back and forth, even though I don't speak Chinese at all and they don't speak English. And so we would just keep translating our emails. And they actually sent me, they had carrier testing. They sent me their reports and really asked for guidance in classifying their variants because they saw I was part of the expert panel, and then also asked for some help securing genetic counseling. And so I was able to help classify their variants using the ClinGen guidelines from hearing loss, and also was really lucky to find that one of our experts that's based in Beijing had actually just started a bunch of genetic counseling programs in that area, and so was able to actually meet with them and give them genetic counseling. So while many of these are only anecdotal and they were very, very grateful for the experience, I can say that I feel pretty certain that ClinGen has touched a lot of individuals. It's just difficult to collect this information. But if I personally have had many, many experiences with patients reaching out to me and interacting with me based on ClinGen's expert curations, I'm confident that ClinGen really has had some meaningful effects on people's lives. And we hope to continue to collect information in the future like this. So we asked in the survey during ClinGen's 10-year anniversary to please share what ClinGen means to you. And so here are some comments. Many of these are genetics professionals. So ClinGen and its resources have been essential to my work as a clinical and research genetic counselor. I could not accurately do my job without ClinGen. ClinGen is a very helpful tool that we can trust either for clinical cases or research purposes. I'm grateful that we can use it freely. Thank you for the comprehensive and reliable information on your website. It's a first-tier resource for all my curation work. The resources I've been able to access and utilize thanks to ClinGen is priceless. You're all amazing. Keep up the good work. This is what true research advancement looks like. So it was good to hear all of that information when we collected this for the 10-year anniversary. So I had a couple of questions about variant curation, and I have this listed at the end too, but some really specific questions that I got about curating both genes, variants, actionability, copy number variants will be addressed in coming weeks. So I did not include those. I included just some general questions related to ClinGen here. So a couple of people asked, when will the pilot calculator for the new ACMG AMP ClinGen-CAP guidelines be released to the public? So there are multiple phases of piloting for this framework. They have just finished phase 2, which were laboratories that signed up to pilot the guidelines. The next phase is phase 3 of piloting the framework. This will likely start next month in February 2026. And this will actually open access to anyone who wants to pilot this framework and to the community. So at this point in time, the pilot calculator should be available for anyone to test it and give feedback. So please look out for that next month. And you can potentially sign up for updates via the ClinGen website to try to get updates about this. Another question that I had is when a variant is reported as pathogenic by multiple laboratories in a specific population, how does ClinGen assess whether this variant is also pathogenic in other populations? Is ancestry or ethnicity explicitly considered during variant curation? I will say this is a yes and a no. So if a variant is pathogenic or benign with enough evidence, and I say this in the case of highly penetrant or moderately penetrant monogenic disease. We're not talking about GWAS. We're not talking about complex conditions in this case, as ClinGen really has first and foremost in the beginning focused on rare disease, monogenic disease. So if a variant's pathogenic or benign, in this case with enough evidence, it's pathogenic or benign across all populations. I think when we run into difficulty are those VUSs. So we often only consider ancestry or ethnicity when we think about absence of a variant in population databases. So as we know, much of research is highly biased towards European population, even databases. And so this is why we have moved to get rid of absence in a database being evidence for pathogenicity for a variant, because we know just because a variant is absent in a population level database does not mean that it is absent in the world at large. It's just absent in that subset of individuals that have been sequenced and aggregated in a biobank. And so we want to make sure that a variant isn't too frequent to potentially be causing rare disease, but just because it's absent doesn't mean that it is causing disease. So that's something that we think about when we're classifying variants is what is the representation of a biobank. Another thing that we often think about when we're counting segregations within variant classification is if we need to consider consanguinity when evaluating the variant. Segregation will also often implicate a locus, and in populations where consanguinity is high, we may want to reduce the amount of points. This often happens in gene curation that we're giving segregations, particularly if it's a missense variant in a region that could be really homozygous in a consanguineous population. So that's another reason that we would think of ancestry or ethnicity explicitly considered during variant curation. So variant curation continued. During the talk, it was highlighted how patient variant submissions and Genome Connect can assist in variant classification. Is there a role or a role for use of this evidence as a reputable source evidence in classifying variants? So in general, ClinGen has discouraged the use of reputable source criteria in the ACMG guidelines in favor of using primary data that contributed to the assessment. This really was used, this reputable source criteria. So reputable source classifies a variant as pathogenic, or reputable source classifies a variant as benign, was largely used in the past when certain laboratories were not sharing their data and they were not sharing the evidence that they used to classify a variant as pathogenic or benign. This has really improved over time. And so we found that this is one of the most misused criteria in variant classification, because individuals will use the primary data that the laboratory used, so publications, case counting, ClinVar cases, computational predictors, absence or presence in a biobank. They'll use all of that to classify the variant, but then they'll also say that a laboratory said it was benign or pathogenic. But the laboratory was using much of that same data that they already used when they were classifying the variant. So that's kind of double counting the evidence, because they're using both the primary evidence and the laboratory calling it pathogenic or benign. So in general, for these patient variant submissions, we actually use them for case counting and receiving highly detailed phenotype information. This is very, very useful for those who work in clinical labs. I myself am a clinical lab director. You know that oftentimes you don't get very much clinical information when you're evaluating a patient and signing out reports for them. So these variant specific or clinician specific variant submissions to ClinVar are particularly useful for that you can use these as case counting, and you can use these for phenotypic specificity when you're case counting, and not for the reputable source evidence. But more to come when we talk about variant curation. Okay, so the next set of questions are about data sharing and data inclusion. So one question was, and multiple people asked this, is what role can data from underrepresented populations play in strengthening ClinGen's gene disease validity and variant curation frameworks? And how does ClinGen facilitate inclusion of such data? We agreed that this is very valuable and important, and that speaks to even just the biobank thing that I was just discussing, that there's just not enough representation in biobanks. So while ClinGen doesn't generate or aggregate data themselves. So we don't have a biobank. We don't do any sequencing. We've tried to accomplish this in a few different ways using gathering data from underrepresented populations. So I myself travel pretty internationally and give many workshops along with many of my colleagues within ClinGen. So we are always encouraging and facilitating ClinVar submissions from international contributors. We're always saying, and it said it in the video too, you should submit your data to ClinVar if you can, especially if the variants that you find are absent from ClinVar. Even if they're benign variants, particularly if they're benign variants, if they're absent from ClinVar, if they're absent from Nomad, no one will know that they are benign because they just don't have the right populations to say this. And so I have worked with many different international colleagues to facilitate ClinVar submissions from their laboratories. And another thing that we work with is engaging with international experts to join ClinGen panels and share data for curations. Many of our experts in our variant curation expert panels and our gene curation expert panels share their laboratory data or their research data, phenotype information, their functional assays. So we really do encourage international experts to join ClinGen and participate in this data sharing. And we don't request protected information. We really are just requesting variant level information. So combining all of the case counts you have, for example, for a particular variant, saying this was seen in 10 healthy individuals that have been phenotyped, not, much more protected information than that. So this preserves anonymity of patients, but still allows us to share data and enough phenotype information. And we have a data access and privacy group that has also given us guidelines on this. And then the last way that we can help with this is by classifying variants found in underrepresented populations. So we take community requests on our website for variants to be classified. Many of my expert panels have worked through these community requests. And then also we've gathered from clinical labs variants found in underrepresented populations and tried to aggregate some data and classify these variants too. And these are just starts, of course. We would really like to continue this very, very important work. So I wanted to acknowledge that there was a very thoughtful discussion point mentioning that while international groups have had substantial impact on variant interpretation and patient-derived genomic medicine, rare disease patients really are being, overtapped. So they might start to experience mistrust and fatigue from being approached by multiple registries or biobanks or efforts. And furthermore, the great points were made that global platforms do play an essential role in aggregating evidence and addressing historical underrepresentation, but that their impact may be greatest when they complement rather than bypass local infrastructure. And I would say at ClinGen, or at least in my thoughts, we couldn't agree more. We are a very small but mighty team. And so we agree that there's no point in duplicating effort when we are all so resource constrained throughout the world. So we are trying as much as we can to work together with global aggregators. So Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, GA4GH, Matchmaker Exchange, which is a very large federated network where different international nodes can be made where you can share your data so that people can query it but cannot fully access it. And then also, I am adjacent to the Nomad team, and they're really working hard to get a federated Nomad so that countries can work directly with their data and patients, but so all can have access in a controlled and safe way. So this is definitely a priority so that we are not duplicating efforts and that so that all countries can interact with their own data and really they know their local environment and local patients best. And we definitely agree on that. And so we're really hoping to move towards this. As you can imagine, this is important, but sometimes slow work because we really all have to work together to make sure that security standards are met for all countries. Okay. So let's move on to some ClinVar themes, just checking time, we're good. So people were asking what variants are most useful to submit to ClinVar, and what types of techniques should be used to discover these variants. Is it required to have sophisticated techniques like genome sequencing, or can arrays, genotyping also be used? Could we report SNPs from a case control association study? And so I will say that ClinVar is largely for monogenic, moderate to high penetrance conditions, regardless of the testing method, as long as you are convinced that your variant is in fact real and high quality. And variants should be classified against a particular disease. And so pulling directly from the frequently asked questions from ClinVar, ClinVar does not accept large sets of uncurated variants. So they don't want to have just large sets of variants from GWAS studies. They're suggesting that you submit these data to dbGaP or whatever is your local resource. And that variants that were observed in a patient but not classified for a disease or a drug response. So for example, if I did genome sequencing on my patient and I only classified maybe 5 to 10 of the variants based on how I filtered the data, I shouldn't submit every single variant from that patient's genome because I didn't classify them, I didn't look at them. However, if I did auto classify variants that were benign based on frequency, those can be submitted. And as I mentioned before, those can be really valuable because certain patient populations are definitely underrepresented and we just don't know about variants that are high frequency and benign. So those are okay to submit, those that were auto-classified based on frequency. But if variants were observed but not classified, those should be suggested to submit to DB-SNP or DB-VAR as appropriate. You should also not submit variants with classifications based solely on computational predictions. And variants that include personal identifiable information. But some submissions do not include a variant classification, and those are still appropriate, but they include other types of data that are critical. And so here are a couple examples. If you say, I didn't classify my variant, but I meet these criteria, you can still submit to ClinVar. So submissions from clinicians or patient registries that provide clinical features observed in a patient don't include identifying information, please. If you do multiplex functional assays, submissions of functional data and results from functional data are very critical. And ClinVar has been working a lot with AVE, the Alliance of Variant Effects, to be able to appropriately represent MAVE data. So those multiplexed analysis of variant effect assays. And then also submissions that describe a variant in the literature, those can be tagged as literature only. So if you read about a variant in the literature and you would like to submit it to ClinVar, you can do that. Although that doesn't happen as often anymore because more laboratories submit to ClinVar. And I did have a question, are only clinical labs allowed to submit to ClinVar or laboratories? No, anyone can submit to ClinVar. So as we said here, clinicians can submit to ClinVar. You can work with patient registries to submit to ClinVar. Researchers can submit to ClinVar. It just changes the tags that are on the data. And it's very clear like where the data has come from. But we do encourage everyone to submit to ClinVar. And if you would like to submit to ClinVar and are not sure how to get started, I am happy to work with you. So feel free to reach out. Okay, so let's move on to Genome Connect, which is ClinGen's patient registry, which you saw in the video. So are there any significant complications for Genome Connect's use across countries which have different privacy laws? And so this comes from the frequently asked questions from the Genome Connect website. So they welcome participants from any country in the world who've completed genetic testing. We've already talked about if there are groups that are working locally with patients, please do continue to work locally with patients. We don't need to enroll those patients in Genome Connect. They could go and Matchmaker Exchange as a node, but we would welcome anyone. So at this point, though, we only have consent forms available in English and Spanish. So participants need to be able to read and understand English or Spanish. We are working on more languages as we can, although funding is a bit limited here. So Genome Connect's open to both adults and minors who have the consent of a parent or legal guardian who have had genetic testing. Although we do welcome participants from around the world, we are unable to process and submit data for participants in the European Union, EEA, and the United Kingdom because of the provisions and the GDPR laws. So that is included directly in the frequently asked questions in Genome Connect. Another question about Genome Connect was, how is data quality and phenotypic accuracy ensured for participants submitted information? When I have talked to Genome Connect staff, they often emphasize, and I've heard this from genetic counselors and clinical geneticists, that patients often know their symptoms and phenotypic features best. And if you work in a clinical lab, You also understand that the phenotypic information you get from a test requisition form is almost nothing. And so you can imagine these very detailed surveys are actually quite useful from participants. But I will say that trained team members from Genome Connect, largely actually genetic counselors, do review the information provided in the participant submitted surveys for accuracy. And if they have further questions, the participants are consented to be contacted. Before I move on, related to ClinVar, it's a good question I got is if a submission is allowed for clinicians, labs, and patients while the data is anonymous, how would you be sure there is no duplication of data submitted? It's a great question. You cannot be 100% sure that there is not duplication of data submitted. So, to the best of our ability, what we do when we're evaluating a variant is we grab all the literature we can and we grab all of the information from ClinVar. And we try our best to see if there's any information of overlapping authors for publications. It's actually quite common that authors will publish on a case and then also submit to ClinVar. So we try to see if there's any duplication there. If for Connect submissions, oftentimes they will say where a patient is tested. So you can see if the testing laboratory has submitted to ClinVar and the patient has submitted to ClinVar, that likely is a double count of patients. And when we're in doubt, we count the minimum number of patients so as not to overclassify a variant. But you're right, it is difficult because there's definitely duplicative information in many cases. And that's why we often say that ClinVar is not a case level database like you would consider potentially LOVD LOVID. It's really an assertion level database, and you should try your best to use the evidence that they use for classifying the variant. But it is inevitable that there'll be duplicate submissions, either from publishers of a manuscript and submissions to ClinVar or testing laboratories potentially. Okay, I got some questions about artificial intelligence. So, how is ClinGen preparing for the integration of large-scale AI machine learning tools into curation workflows without compromising expert oversight? It's a great question, and really is something that we have started to explore in the last year or so. As I mentioned, we resubmitted our grant over the summer, and so this was a focus when we wrote our grant renewals. All of the ClinGen grants, there are multiple grants that come together to make ClinGen, are focusing on using AI to improve the experience for curators. So not nearly as much generative AI, but really to facilitate the experience because we know that things can be really manual and that information can be in all different places. So some examples of this include improving literature searching, generating evidence summaries for all of our expert scored evidence. So we would give AI all of the published evidence that we are scoring and ask it to generate a standardized evidence summary of this, like the text evidence summaries that you see on the ClinGen website. This would then be reviewed and approved. And so we wouldn't say just generate this from all of the internet. We would say just generate this from all of the scored information that we scored right here because we know that it's true and we've reviewed it and we've scored it. But then we would review and edit that evidence summary as appropriate. And then another way that we would really like to use it is notifying expert panels when new literature is available for existing curations. So as you may know, the information in genetics literature is changing all of the time. And so we do have recuration policies for all of our curations. It would be great to be able to prioritize. So we prioritize based on the strength of relationships, for example, for gene disease validity or the classifications. So moderate genes, we'll talk about this more in coming weeks, but moderate genes are those that are suggested to change the most with a couple years of more publications or likely pathogenic moving to pathogenic variants. So it would be great to further prioritize those by saying, using AI and saying, look, this gene disease curation has had more publications come up. Please evaluate those publications. And so this is our way of making things more efficient and leveraging AI, but not having it take out the oversight of experts and compromising that. Okay, so for a general note on future lectures, and I mentioned this at the beginning, some people had very specific questions about gene variant and CNV curation. I did not bring them here because they will hopefully be answered in the following weeks through our curation discussions. Do please feel free to resubmit those specific questions as we get to that curation week. And next week we will tackle variant curation. So with that, that is all the questions that I have prepared for this week. And thank you to all of you who submitted questions. Please do continue to submit questions. And I think we do have about 15 minutes or so to take any more questions, either unmuted or in the chat. So I will stop sharing and I will open it up for additional questions. Feel free to unmute yourself. I see we have a hand raised. Mohammed? Okay. Any other questions that people would like to ask? Feel free to stick them in the chat or unmute yourself. Now you have a question of what is the difference between genetics and genomics? And I will say a lot of times people will use genetics and genomics interchangeably. A lot of the times you'll see genetic testing, you'll see genomic sequencing. So I would say for all intents and purposes, most of the time they are synonymous. Oftentimes when I think of genomics, I think of like large scale analysis or sequencing, but I would say that many folks use genetics and genomics interchangeably, oftentimes. For example, the fellowship that we have in the United States is called Laboratory Genetics and Genomics, really suggesting that if they named the fellowship that oftentimes they are used interchangeably. Any other questions?
I have one question.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Good evening. I'm Zanava from Ethiopia. Thank you for getting this chance. So I have watched the previous video or lecture notes, and I have one question. Since does any failure or challenges of the variant curation or genomic curation?
So you're asking about challenges in variant curation?
Yeah, there are a number of genes or genetic variations associated with disease as well as dose sensitivity curation, but I didn't see any reports or presented data on whether they have faced challenges or failure in curation of the clinical genomics or the association of dosage, sensitivity, curation, or pathogenic variations.
Yeah, I will say that this was a bit of a broad overview this week, and so we will go into all of the different curation styles in the next couple weeks, and we'll definitely talk about some of the different challenges there. I would say one general challenge to many curation styles is that the evidence that we use to score these curations are presented in many different places. So a database here, a publication here, ClinVar here. And so it can be really difficult to aggregate all of them and can take a lot of time. And they are not standard. The the format that they're provided in is not standardized many times. So many variants, for example, are often hidden in the supplements of journals, so large tables that sometimes may not even be attached to an article. So I would say sometimes the biggest challenge across many of the different efforts is the lack of standardization of data and the locations of data. Someone will ask me, where do I go to find all the evidence for a variant curation? Unfortunately, there's no single place for that. There are certain databases like ClinGen and ClinVar try their best to have information, but they don't have all the information. So I think that's maybe the biggest challenge at large across all of the different curation efforts. But we'll definitely jump into some of the more specific challenges each week as we talk about variant curation and gene curation and actionability curation.
Great.
Great. Arya, I think, has a hand up.
Yeah. Hi, good morning and good evening to all. I'm Arya from India. So I have a question about the Genome Connect. So once the data is submitted by the physicians or the patients, how is that data validated? Because I'm not sure how robust is the clinicians or the geneticists across the world are classifying variant of uncertain significances. So before finalizing or concluding it into the ClinVar, how is it validated? Is there any step that is done from ClinGen side to validate it before making it public?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I did include it in the slide. So the Genome Connect team reviews every single submission to Genome Connect for accuracy. We obviously can't actually meet with the patients directly, but if there are any questions or inconsistencies, the patients are consented to be contacted. And so we try to get further information to clarify that. But pretty much genetic counselors review all of the submissions to Genome Connect to the best of their ability for accuracy.
So are there any conditions, like if you find an interesting case, and if there is a chance to do a functional study from your end, do you go back to the patients if there is a provision to do that?
Yes, we will often recontact patients if a researcher will potentially reach out, as long as they've been consented to be recontacted.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. I'm just going to go numerically now. So Aya.
أي رفاعي. Yes. Yes. Hi everyone. This is Aya Rifai from Egypt, and I have a question related to gene curation. I can understand the concept of variant curation, and we're trying to assign pathogenicity or to make sure that the variant could be benign. But what's meant by gene curation, and how could it be curated?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we'll talk about gene curation in a couple weeks, but in short, you need to do gene curation before you do variant curation. So you need to know that a gene is actually causing and related to a particular disease before you can say that a variant in that gene is damaging. So you can have, for example, a loss of function variant in a gene, and you know that the variant gets rid of the gene. But if the gene isn't known to cause any disease, you shouldn't report that variant back to a patient because you don't know what disease it would potentially cause for them. So gene curation in laboratories and in our groups is done first before variant curation. And genes have to reach a certain level of evidence before you can even curate variants within those genes.
But I think if the gene is not related to any disease, it will be less likely that it will be reported to the patient or in the report of genomic testing.
You would think that, but I've had so many examples of, at least in the past, laboratories would just include as many genes as possible to make it look like there was a better value. I speak from the US experience, so I can't really say about internationally, but laboratories would just have the biggest possible testing menus that they could have, and they would return back so many variants of uncertain significance, causing confusion with patients and clinicians just because they included all of these genes on their panels. And so we actually have had to come up with multiple policy statements, at least in the American College of Medical Genetics, requiring that gene curation be done before variants can be reported on clinical tests.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
There are 2 questions
Okay.
in the chat from Iman Ramadan and Atabis.
Yep. So one question is, can you elaborate about the high frequency of a variant in highly consanguineous populations as evidence for pathogenicity? So I think this is maybe kind of mushed together. So if a variant is high frequency in a population, oftentimes we would say that it is not causing disease. That being said, if it is a population that has a high frequency of consanguinity, this might not always be true, but oftentimes how we factor in consanguinity is in proband counting, we'll usually just count segregations in a highly consanguineous population instead of individual unrelated probands because the background is often related. And we also look at the testing technology more so, and this will be discussed in coming weeks, the testing technology that was used to detect the variant. So were they just genotyping for this variant? Did they do linkage analysis and they sequenced all of the genes in the linkage region so that we can really be sure that a homozygous variant might be causing disease? These are things that we think about when we evaluate variants from consanguineous populations. This happens a lot in the hearing loss expert panel that I mentioned I'm very closely involved with. To grab another question from the chat, and then I'll go back to the hands raised here. What are the challenges facing Genome Connect using the patient registry form? And before scientists disseminate the data from other clinical labs, did the patients get involved? So the patient registry form, I will say, as I mentioned, the consents are only in certain languages thus far. So I think that's maybe the biggest difficulty is we just don't have a ton of funding to be translating registry forms into other languages as much as we would really like to. And we want to make sure it's done correctly and done accurately. So I would say that's a big challenge. And when clinicians or clinical labs submit their variant classifications to ClinVar, they may include grouped together anonymized information about patients. And many clinical labs will consent patients or include in their consent that they submit variants to ClinVar, but that variants, that data will be aggregated and de-identified before submitted to ClinVar. Okay, so I'm going to go back to hands that are raised here. So I think Adam is next.
Oh, good evening, everyone.
Hello.
This is Adam Haruna. I'm speaking from Nigeria. My question is there, throughout our training course, is there a way where we'll be taking stepwise on how to do this variant curation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So next week we'll be talking about variant curation. And so we will have a video and then I'll have some articles. And then if possible, I might be able to give you some information about how to practice some variant curations yourself. So ClinGen has some interfaces, like anyone can use our variant curation interface. And so I might provide you some instructions of how to register for this variant curation interface and try to practice a couple variants.
All right, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll go back to the chat. I think we only have 5 minutes. My challenge so far is with articles as they're and functional studies as their unlimited lab experiments. So is there a way to map what types of studies when we talk about genes or variants, because it gets very confusing? Yes, I agree. Functional evidence is oftentimes what many clinicians or curators have questions about. So in gene curation, we do give very specific categories that we suggest to score for evidence implicating genes being related to diseases. And we've also tried to publish some clarifications about that for functional assays for variant curation too, suggesting the number of controls that should be used to validate an assay. Expert panels will go through and evaluate assays for their particular genes and tell you which assays are most robust and validated there. So we've tried our best, but I agree the landscape is a bit confusing there. Okay, Barbara?
Okay, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So I wanted to ask about the variance. As you were talking about a point that a variance may be benign or submitted as benign from one lab and pathogenic by another. So when is that? I mean, I heard there was a way to validate it and come up with a one that may be suitable. And the follow-up is that has it ever happened that within let's say have you ever reported or has there been a report that a variance is reported as or validated as pathogenic from one ethnic group but benign for another? And if it hasn't happened, is it possible that that could happen?
It's a great question. And so I will say, ClinGen has really tried hard to work with all the submitters in ClinVar to get them to share data with each other to come to consistent classifications, because yes, there are conflicting variant submissions in ClinVar where some labs will say that something is benign, and we call these medically significant differences, and some labs will say that it's pathogenic. So expert panels will go in and try to get all of the information from all of the submitters and classify it using their expert opinion, and resolve those differences. And if there is no expert panel in that particular disease area, ClinGen staff have started to work with all of the different submitters to try to get them to share all of their information so that we can try to classify them with certainty. And in general, at least, and I speak in the case of monogenic rare disease that's highly penetrant, there have not been examples that a variant is benign in one population and pathogenic in another. That being said, this is not for GWAS. This is not for complex disease where you would have multiple variants factoring in to a particular classification or polygenic risk scores. There can definitely be different haplotypes or combinations of variants there that may have different effects. But if a variant is high frequency in one population, it cannot cause rare disease in any population. You just start to call into question if a variant is pathogenic just because it's absent from a population, or if someone has said a variant is pathogenic because it's absent from a population, if that's really true, because of the lack of representation in sequencing databases. So that's where we are there.
I have one last question related to the previous one. How can we
I will say,
accurately?
Aya, that I have other people who are had raised their hands first, so I think I need to give maybe one more minute to another person. But as we go, feel free to stick more questions in the form in the following weeks. Nashit?
So I'm a clinician working in clinical genetics. So my question is regarding, in our busy clinic, we often use online predictor tools that classify the variant. The most commonly used one is Franklin. My question is like how reliable these online tools are in, calculating the pathogenicity of these variants quickly and giving the executive summary from all the sources. And do you also know any other models that are more reliable and validated in the clinical use?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will say that ClinGen has a list of software providers that have met requirements that they deem to be more valid. And Franklin is actually one of those listed in the ClinGen software list, in that it actually factors in some of the specifications that ClinGen expert panels have created. to update the guidelines. And so I will say that Franklin is probably one of the better ones, and it is often open source that you can use in the clinic. I think each of them have their challenges and their limitations. But for something that's quick, I think consulting ClinVar and trying to use an open source tool like that, like Franklin, is maybe your best way to go.
Thank you
Okay,
very
so
much.
you're welcome. I would say we're 4 minutes after now, and I do have to run to another meeting in 1 minute. But thank you so much for these wonderful questions. I really hope that you've enjoyed this discussion as much as I had. It is a lot more interesting when people actually actively participate, and you participated both in the forum and both in this call. So I've really enjoyed myself. I hope you have too. We will reconvene again next week for variant curation. And I'll just turn it over to you, Wafa, if you want to close.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you and thank you everyone for commitment and discipline and for your questions. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll chat next week. Look forward to my email coming likely on Sunday for variant curation for the next week.
Is there a survey, sorry, a quiz you will send or share to all of them, or at the end of the workshop?
I will probably send something at the end of the workshop that kind of factors in like all 4 weeks.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, all. Bye.
Have a good day. Bye.